Welcome to AECOsim Building Designer Connect Edition. In this session, we will take a look at one of the companion applications, generative components. So in the example project, the mixed-use retail building, the curved roof form was actually modeled using generative components. So generative components is a companion application that allows script-based modeling or computational design, meaning that you can model something using variables and other types of controls to facilitate creating geometry that is otherwise difficult to create and to modify. So if you open AECOsim Building Designer with generative components, you will see an additional workflow, which is computational design. So I've opened the GC Roof Geometry DGN in Generative Components, and on the Model tab, I've selected the Show Transactions so that I see the transactions. So the transactions are the steps that were used to create the model, and those are recorded, and you can play and unplay those transactions. Currently they're all unplayed, and I'm going to step through those to demonstrate how this model is created. Now I have reference to it, part of the Building Designer model, which is the rooftop core elements, and I've set the floor selector to the roof, and that shows the grid, which is part of AECOsim Building Designer. So I'm just going to start playing the transactions here. The first transaction creates a base coordinate system. This is basically the 0, 0 origin. It just helps us align our geometry in space and with the rest of the Building Designer model. Next, I'm adding a couple of variables. These are variables that define the dimensions of the X and Y bays of the grid. I just want to make sure I can line up with the grid I've designed in Building Designer, and I've made them variables so if that grid would happen to change, it would be easy to change that here as well. Once you have sliders or variables in your model, you may want to open up the control panel. This is the Show Controls option, and I can see those variables there. I can see their current value, and I could adjust that value. The next step is to add building and floor nodes. Now these are basically reading the information that's in our floor manager for Building Designer and establishing those same ACS planes here in the Generative Components model. So again, if changes were made to the floor manager, they would be picked up here in the Generative Components model as well. I'm going to add a couple more variables. So these are just defining how many X and Y bays we have and then creating a point grid, and you can see all the points align with the current grid. And just to demonstrate, I'll show if I were to change, for instance, the value of the X bay, I'm just going to slide it over here and make it 30 feet. You can see that all the points move and adjust based on that. Now they no longer line up with my Building Designer grid, so I'm going to switch it back to 25. But you can see how easily you can make adjustments to a Generative Components model. Now I'm going to go ahead and add a law curve. So a law curve is another type of control. And you can see this node on the map. And this is just a curve which I can adjust here. And that's controlling the actual curve of the roof. And we'll come back and play with that in just a minute. And then we use that law curve to create an actual B-spline curve and then extend that B-spline curve into a surface. Again, if I modify the curve, then it modifies the downstream geometry, the curve and the surface. And then in the next step, I'm going to actually add some geometry in order to create walls around the perimeter of the roof. And then I want those walls to extend up to that curved surface. So in this case, I'm actually going to create Building Designer walls. They come from the same data group catalog as they would in Building Designer. And so that's the next step. It's actually adding those walls based on that perimeter shape. And they extend up to my curved geometry. Again, if the curved geometry were to change, that would then change the height of the walls. And in this next step, I'm actually exporting that wall geometry out to a separate DGN file, which will actually be referenced into the BIM model. So it's actually exported that geometry out. I'm going to just switch over and open up Building Designer here and take a look at that file, a roof exterior. And that actually is what will be referenced into the rest of the BIM model. Now let's go back to the Generative Components file and continue to run the transaction. Now we're actually going to generate structure that's going to hold up that roof. And so we're actually using columns and beams, again from Building Designer, actual structural steel shapes with data on them. So the first step is I'm just adding lines at all the grid intersections, so this is where the columns will go. And then in this step we're actually adding structural columns using that line work. So now we have structural steel columns. Next we're going to add curve beams. These are the major beams that run between the columns and follow the curve of the roof. So again, they're using that roof geometry. So there's the beams. And next we're going to add some coordinate systems along those beams, and this will be to generate the secondary beams that will run between the curved beams. Again, following the curved roof geometry. And then we're going to use those points to generate a series of beams running across the roof. And finally, we will export that geometry again to a separate sroof framing file to be included in the Building Designer model. And now I'm going to unplay some transactions and go back up to a point here where you can see it says modify roof curve here. So I'm going to go back up and modify that law curve and then regenerate the geometry, which again will get exported out to the DGN files and create new geometry for the Building Designer model. So I've unplayed up to transaction 10 where it says modify roof curve here. So if we look at this, we may notice our curved roof is actually intersecting part of that roof core that's coming up. So perhaps we want to make some adjustments. So I'm going to go ahead and select the law curve node. And by just playing with the controls here, I can adjust that curve and I can see those modifications in the model as I make them. So perhaps I want to raise this up on the back end. I can kind of play around with that till I get something I like. And once I've got that base curve defined, I simply replay the rest of the transactions and it will regenerate all the geometry. So I'm just going to select play all remaining transactions and let that run. Note that that change I made here was recorded as another transaction. So that means it's a step I could suppress at some point if I want to go back to the previous geometry. I could delete it. So it gives you a great deal of flexibility in the creation of the model. And now I'll just open up Building Designer again and take a look at our sroof framing and a roof exterior. So I encourage you to take a look at Generative Components and to open up that GC roof geometry model and play around with those transactions a little bit and modify the roof geometry and see just how easy it is.